Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Elaine, and today we're going to be upcycling some of the thrifted items from my last thrift haul. If you missed my last video where I showed you all the great items I found at the thrift store, I'll link that below, so make sure you check that out. If you're new to my channel, thanks so much for stopping by. I'd love for you to subscribe and join our DIY family. If you also click on the notification bell and select all, you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. If you're already subscribed, I hope you're finding inspiration in my projects and creating some projects of your own. So let's get started on today's DIY. For DIY number 1, we're going to take this outdated clock and make it new. So I'm going to remove the stickers. I did get this at the thrift store. And then we're going to take all of the staples out of the back. Now those staples were in there pretty good, so it took a little bit to get those out. I did end up getting my needle nose pliers out to pull them out. The round part of the clock, the outside part, was wood, so they were in there pretty well. So once I got all of the staples out, I did take a disinfecting wipe and clean it up a little bit. It was pretty dirty. And I wanted to make sure that the paint adhered really well. Then I'm going to take the clock part out. I was a little worried that I was going to break it, so I was trying to be really careful. But I finally figured it out. Once I got all the pieces off, I just set that to the side. And then I wiped down everything to clean it up a little bit. And I'm going to paint the facing black in the Waverly ink chalk paint. Even though I'm going to cover it by the printable doesn't reach all the way to the edges, so I wanted that black to show through on the edges. So I just went ahead and painted the whole thing. So I'll put that to the side, and then I'm going to paint the wood piece in Waverly's white chalk paint. And I'm going to give it a really good coat. I'll end up distressing it at the end, but I wanted to cover it really well. The Waverly chalk paint is really good at coating it. So I'm just going to turn it around and do the back as well. I always like to do the backs of my projects because I want it to look complete. And I do resell my items, so I want to make sure they look really good. And I'm very impatient, so you'll see I'm taking my hair dryer, which I also picked up at the thrift store, drying that up. So I'm going to put that to the side and work on the clock face. I did create this on my silhouette. The image on the front came from the Graphics Fairy. If you haven't been to the Graphics Fairy site, I'll link that below. She has the most wonderful graphics, vintage and antique graphics, and they're free to use. So check out that link below. So I'm just going to Mod Podge the whole back of it, and I put a really good coat on it. Now I didn't measure where to put this. I just kind of eyeballed it to make sure it was in the middle. If you're making a project like this, you can measure it if you want. But I'm going to coat the top with a really good coat of Mod Podge. Now, it does look shiny when you first put it on, but once it dries, it does dry more matte. And I picked up that little bottle of Mod Podge at Dollar Tree. So again, I'm going to use my hair dryer to dry it up in patience. So we're going to go back and distress the wood piece. Now I picked up these sanding blocks at the Dollar Tree as well, but I have really used them a lot and they're a little worn out. So I do need to get some new ones. You'll see I ended up putting that one to the side and getting another one. It was a little worn out as well. But it ended up working out. I did a pretty good distressing on this. The dark wood I wanted to shine through. It was pretty. I pretty much distressed everything. You don't have to do this on your project if you want it just to be the solid color. I just cleaned all the dust off, wiped it down a little bit. And then I'm going to take a clear coat, the Waverly clear wax, and go over the whole thing just so it seals in the paint really well. I'm going to put that to the side. And then we're going to go back and put the clock parts back in. I'm using just a little tool that I had with a jewelry making kit. I am a DIYer, so of course I tried jewelry making as well. I wasn't the biggest fan of it, but I do still use a lot of those items to embellish some of my projects. Now, as I'm putting the clock mechanism back in, I struggled a little bit remembering exactly where all the pieces went. So if you're doing a project like this, just remember where everything went, all the little screws, which hand goes on first. But I did end up figuring it out. I'm also wiping everything down just cleaning off those hands as well. So now I'm going to put everything back together. I started putting the facing in, and then I realized I hadn't put the plastic front back on. So I pulled that back out. And then I cleaned up the plastic front as well. It was pretty dirty. And then it had some little notches that plastic piece set down in. So I just used my hot glue to glue that back in place. And then I'm going to put the facing back on, and I'm going to hot glue that on as well instead of putting the staples back in. And I am trying to make sure that I don't turn it so the little hook is straight up and down. And I am going to put a battery in it just to make sure it works properly. And it did. Here's a look at how it turned out. What a difference from the original. So on to DIY number 2. I love these little pitchers and these jugs that I picked up, and we are going to use the baking soda and paint texture to go on these. The little hearts and flowers on them were a little bit raised, so I thought this chalk paint would cover those up really well. I also picked up those other these graphics from the Graphic Fairy as well. And I printed them on tissue paper. This is the first time I've ever used the tissue paper, printing on the tissue paper, and it worked out pretty well. If you want to see a video on how I did that, let me know in the comments below. So I'm adding the same part of baking soda as to my paint, and I did mix a little bit of white in with my mineral Waverly chalk paint just to lighten it up a little bit, because I wanted it to look like the color of normal Crocs. So I'm going to give it a good coat all over. And I am using a chip brush on this just to add a little texture as well. I'm not going to paint down on the insides. I am cleaning them all really well with alcohol just to make sure there's no residue on the outside. And I picked up this little pumper at Dollar Tree as well, and I love it. So again, I'm just going to do this on all 5. Just doing the outsides and the rim. I just thought all these items were really cute, but they were a little outdated, so I wanted to change them a little bit, make them look old but new. We're just going to finish up our last one. And sometimes these chip brushes do shed a little bit. So you just have to be careful and pull those little pieces off. And the longer this paint mixture stays in the dish, it does get a little thicker. So by the time I got to the last one, it was pretty thick. I'm just going to touch it up a little bit. And of course, bring in my hairdryer to dry them up in patience again. This little $3 hairdryer has been great. So once I get them all dry, I'm going to start putting the tissue paper on them. So I had these paint rollers, they're sponge paint rollers, and I thought they would be great to hold it in place so it wouldn't rock back and forth. And I'm using Mod Podge in Antique. I thought it would give it a little bit more vintage, but after I used it, I decided next time I'll probably use just the clear matte Mod Podge. So I'm just putting a good coating right where that tissue paper is going to go. And then I'm using my paintbrush just to put it on so I can put it on evenly. And then keeping your paintbrush wet, just lightly go over the tissue paper just so you don't tear it, because it tears really easy. So I'm using my paintbrush just to get some of the wrinkles out. Again, really lightly. And this is the first time I've ever used the tissue paper, printing on the tissue paper. But it was fairly easy. But you can see on this one, I did tear the tissue paper, and I decided I was just going to go ahead and try to use it, see if I could put it on evenly. It was a little bit of a struggle. But as you'll see, I do end up figuring it out. Again, just make sure that your paintbrush is always staying really wet with the Mod Podge. After a few attempts, I did finally get it on there pretty straight. I'm just going around all the edges and trying to smooth it out a little bit. So the first two, I used the grain sack and the sheep, and the last three I'm going to be using the bee And I just love these bees. The Graphics Fairy had so many graphics to choose from. It was pretty difficult trying to decide which ones I wanted to use. So I used 3 different bee designs. And using my brush to put it on. Nice wet brush to smooth it out. I had to move around those paint rollers just to get it to stay flat. So after those dried, and yes, I did use my hair dryer to get those dried, I decided to use some of the clear wax from Waverly. And I wanted it to be white as well, but I didn't have any white wax. So I did add just a dab of white Waverly chalk paint in there as well, just to give it a little bit of a whitewashed effect. So I applied that in sections, and then I took a paper towel and just dabbed it off because I didn't want it to be all white. I just wanted that whitewash effect. So I did that on all 3 of the small pictures, and I really like how that turned out. Okay, you guys, here's where it all went wrong. I decided I was going to use the antique Mod Podge to go over it to give it a more antique look. And I hated the way it looked. And it may have been because I used the chip brush. If I would have used a smoother brush, it would have looked a little better. But it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. Not all projects do. I have quite a few project fails. Sometimes you just have to learn from those and either change them or move on to something different. Let me know in the comments below if you like how that turned out or if you would have just whitewashed them all. And here's a look at how they turned out. Let me know in the comments below what you think about them. So DIY number 3. This was one of my favorite items that I picked up at the thrift store. It was pretty worn, so I cleaned it up really well. And I am using a small paintbrush to get in around the wire pieces. I could have taken that off, but it had really tiny screws in it, and I didn't want to have to deal with those tiny screws. So the little paintbrush worked really well to get around that. I'm just going to use the small paintbrush on the small pieces, and then I'm going to take a little bit larger paintbrush to do the larger areas. So I'm just going to give this piece a good coating of the white chalk paint just to freshen it up. And of course, you know I'm going to go back and distress it at the end. So once I gave the whole thing a full coverage of paint, I moved on to these little tins. They were really heavy, galvanized, and I wanted to keep that galvanized look. So I just took my chip brush and just dry brushed it over a little bit just to give it a little more dimension. Now I am going to dry these up a little bit before I move on to adding the graphics on the front. I'm going to put more of the tissue paper graphics, and they're more designs from the Graphics Fairy. Again, if you're looking for some beautiful graphics that are free, check out that website. It's linked below. So I'm going to cut around as close as I can. And then this time I am using the clear Mod Podge, and it worked out so much better. And I'm just doing the same thing, keeping my brush really wet with the Mod Podge and just smoothing it out, just really lightly. The graphics that I'm putting on are lavender, oregano, and peppermint. And don't forget, you guys, if you're not already subscribed, make sure you hit that subscribe button and notification bell, because I have a ton more videos coming up from my thrift store haul. I'm just going to dry those up really well, and then I'm going to take my chip brush and just go around the edges just to blend those edges in so they don't stand out. You guys, I think these turned out so pretty. So now I'm going to go ahead and distress. Like I said, if you've seen any of my other videos, you know I distress everything. So we're going to add that Waverly chalk paint and ink. And I'm just going to go around all the edges. And I am just dry brushing it. And there's just something about the black and white that I just really love. Now, my daughter-in-law gifted me a whole box of stamps, and I've never used stamps before, but I think I'm gonna love them. Normally, I use my silhouette to print out vinyl or stencils to put on my items, but these stamps are awesome. So I chose birds for this one. And I chose just 2 different birds. And there were so many stamps to choose from. It took a while for me to figure out what I wanted to use, but I think the birds turned out really well. So I'm going to put my little buckets in and use them as a planner. And here's how it turned out. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this project. DIY number 4. This spice rack was a little worn out and old, had a lot of coats of paint on it, but we're going to change it, make it a little bit more farmhouse. So of course we're going to be using white paint. But I did clean it up really well with my Clorox wipes before I got started, just to make sure to get all of the grime and any residue from the little stickers. And we're going to use stamps on this project as well. So I'm going to give this a good coat of the white Waverly chalk paint. And I love this paint because it's such a good coverage. It normally only takes one coat. Depending on how heavy you put it on, I typically put it on pretty heavy. And you can see I'm using a chip brush. Normally on a project like this, I would just use a regular brush. I'm not sure why I picked the chip brush for this one. It does tend to leave more paint lines. So if you're doing this, you may want to use a smoother brush to keep from getting those paint lines. But you can see this white chalk paint is covering those colors really well. What a difference a little paint makes. So once that's dried, I'm going to go ahead and distress it a little bit, staying with that black and white theme, using the Waverly ink and black. Just dry brushing the edges. Just have a really light amount of paint on my brush. Now we're just going to use these these stamps in a flower and just some leaves. And once I put these leaves on, I wasn't sure why I put them on where I did. I thought maybe I should have put them coming out from the flower, but you just learn as you go. It ended up looking just fine the way it was. Here's a look at how it turned out. What a transformation little paint can do. And here's a look at all of the projects. Let me know what you think about all these projects in the comments below. Which one is your favorite? Thank you for staying with me through all these projects. I hope you enjoyed it and they give you a little inspiration to go out and find some thrift store items and transform them into something that fits your decor. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. And also you will find me on Facebook at A Handful of Daisies Home Decor. I hope to see you there as well.